and by the time he'd finished, I was hooked. The story, as Rick told it to me over lunch that day, went like this. Macara had caught the last ferry from Woods Hole, Massachusetts, to Martha's Vineyard 2 Sundays ago. A gale had been blowing since mid-afternoon, and the last few crossings had been cancelled. But towards 9 o'clock, the wind eased slightly, and at 9:45, the master decided it was safe to cast off. The boat was crowded, and Macara was lucky to get a space for his car. He parked below decks and then went upstairs to get some air. No one saw him alive again. It was nearly 11 when the ferry made land at Vineyard Haven, and the car started up, all except one, a brand-new tan-colored Ford Escape SUV. When the owner didn't show, the crew tried the doors, which turned out to be unlocked, and freewheeled the big Ford down to the quayside. A police check on the Ford's license plate revealed it to be registered to one Martin S. Reinhardt of New York City. "This is the Marty Reinhardt," I interrupted. "This is he." Reinhardt immediately confirmed over the telephone to the police that the Ford belonged to him. He kept it at his house on Martha's Vineyard for the use of himself and his guest in the summer. He also confirmed that, despite the time of year, a group of people were staying at the moment. A local woman found the body early the next morning, thrown up on the beach about 4 miles down the island's coast at Lambert's Cove. The driver's license in the wallet confirmed him to be Michael James Macara, age 50, from Balham in South London. The police took his corpse to the little morgue in Vineyard Haven and then drove over to the Reinhardt residence to break the news and to fetch one of the other guests to identify him. "Well, it must have been quite a scene," said Rick, when the volunteer guest finally showed up to view the body. There was one patrol car from Edgartown with a blue flashing light, a second car with 4 armed guards to secure the building, and a third vehicle, bomb-proof, carrying the instantly recognizable man who, until 18 months earlier, had been the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. What on earth was an ex-Prime Minister doing identifying the body of a man from Balham who fell off the Martha's Vineyard ferry, I said. "Michael Macara," announced Rick with the emphatic delivery of a man who has flown 3,000 miles to deliver this punchline, "was helping him write his memoirs. And this is where, in that parallel life, I finish my drink, say goodbye, and step out into the chilly London street with the whole of my undistinguished career stretching safely ahead of me. Instead, you realize I don't know anything about politics," I said. "Well, you voted for him, didn't you?" "Well, of course I did. Everybody voted for him." "Well, that's the point." He glanced around. "Marty Reinhardt paid $10 million for these memoirs on the condition that they would be in the bookstores within 2 years. And from what I hear, he's nowhere near meeting that requirement. Reinhardt are getting frantic, and they're holding a beauty parade at their London office tomorrow morning. I promise you, it's a great opportunity for you, and the money will be good. The kids won't starve." "I don't have any kids." "No," said Rick with a wink. "But I do." We parted on the steps of the club. Rick had a car waiting outside with his engine running. "See you tomorrow," he said, and dramatically, in a puff of exhaust fumes, he was gone. Mephistopheles on a 15% commission. I was left in that narrow zone where Soho washes up against Covent Garden, a strip of empty theatres, dark alleys, red lights, snack bars and bookshops. I often drop into one to see how my titles are displayed, and that is what I did that afternoon. Once inside, it was a short step across the scuffed red carpet of the biography and memoir department, and suddenly I'd gone from celebrity to politics. I was surprised by how much they had on the former Prime Minister, an entire shelf. Everything from the early hagiography, Adam Lang, Statesman for Our Time, to a recent hatchet job entitled Would You Adam and Eve It? The Collected Lies of Adam Lang. I bought myself a small pile of research material and headed out of the bookshop. It was obvious the moment I got outside that another bomb had gone off. At Tottenham Court Road, people were surging up above ground from all 4 exits of the tube station like storm water from a blocked drain. A loudspeaker said something about an incident at Oxford Circus. It took me 2 full hours to walk home. Kate had already let herself in and was watching the news. Kate. I'd forgotten she was coming over for the evening. I kissed the top of her head, dropped the books onto the sofa and went into the kitchen to pour myself a whiskey. "The entire tube is down. I've had to walk all the way from Covent Garden," I said. When I went back into the living room, she was removing one book after another from the carrier bag. "What's all this?" she said, looking up. And then she realized what was going on. "No, oh, don't tell me they want you to ghost his book. Oh, you cannot be serious." "Why, it'll probably come to nothing," I said, and drank some more whiskey. She went back to watching the news, only now with her arms tightly folded, always a warning sign. The ticker tape announced that the death toll was 7, and likely to rise. "There was a time," said Kate slowly, after what felt like a very long silence, "when princes taking their countries to war were supposed to risk their lives in battle. Now they travel around in bomb-proof cars with armed bodyguards and make fortunes 3,000 miles away while the rest of us are stuck with the consequences of their actions. I just don't understand you." She got up and went into the bedroom to collect the bag she always brought on the night she planned to stay. I heard her filling it noisily with lipstick, toothbrush, perfume spray. I knew if I went in, I could retrieve the situation, but the truth was, at that moment, given a choice between an evening of her smug, left-wing moralizing and the prospect of working with a so-called war criminal, I preferred the war criminal. So I simply carried on staring at the television. Reinhardt Publishing UK consisted of 5 ancient firms acquired during a vigorous bout of corporate kleptomania in the 90s. Wrenched out of their Dickensian garrets in Bloomsbury, upsized, downsized, rebranded, renamed, reorganised, modernised and merged, they had finally been dumped in Hounslow, in a steel and smoked glass office block with all its pipes on the outside. Quigley was waiting for me by the lifts. "I have to tell you," he said as we rose to the penthouse floor, "that I don't think you're the right man for this assignment." "Well, then it's a good job it's not your decision, Roy," I said. The man who really ran the global show was waiting for us in the boardroom. John Maddox, chief executive of Reinhardt Inc. Next to him was Lang's Washington attorney, Sidney Kroll, a bespectacled 40-something with a delicate pale face and floppy raven hair. "And Nick Riccardelli, I think you know," said Quigley, completing the introductions. My agent winked up at me. "Hi, Rick," I said. "I gather from Rick you're aware of the situation, and yet you know what we're looking for," Maddox began. "So perhaps you could tell us exactly what you think you'd bring to this project." "Ignorance," I said brightly, which at least had the benefit of shock value. And before anyone could interrupt, I launched into the little speech I'd rehearsed in the taxi coming over. "I'll be completely honest, I don't read political memoirs." "So what?" I shrugged. "Nobody does. But actually, that's not my problem." I pointed at Maddox. "That's your problem. Now, rumour has it you paid $10 million for this book," I went on. "As things stand, how much of that do you think you're going to see back? 2 million? 3? Well, that's bad news for you, and that's especially bad news," I said, turning to Kroll, "for your client. Because for him, this isn't about money. This is about reputation. This is Adam Lang's opportunity to speak directly to history, to get his case across." I know, in retrospect, what a huckster I sounded, but this was pitch talk, remember, which, like declarations of undying love in a stranger's bedroom at midnight, shouldn't necessarily be held against you the next morning. I leaned forwards. "You see, here's the joke. A leader's autobiography ought to be more interesting than most memoirs, not less. So I see my ignorance about politics as an advantage. I cherish my ignorance, quite frankly. Besides, Adam Lang doesn't need any help from me with the politics of this book. He's a political genius, What he does need, in my humble opinion, is the same thing a movie star needs, or a baseball player, or a rock star, an experienced collaborator who knows how to ask him the questions which will draw out his heart. There was a silence. I was trembling. Rick gave my knee a reassuring pat under the table. Nicely done.
What utter balls,
said Quigley. Think so? Asked Maddox, still looking at me. He said it in a neutral voice, but if I had been Quigley, I would have detected danger.
Oh, John, of course,
said Quigley, with all the dismissive scorn of 4 generations of Oxford scholars behind him. Adam Lang is a world historical figure, and his autobiography is going to be a world publishing event. It shouldn't be approached like a feature for a celebrity magazine. It seems to me, said Maddox, that I have entire warehouses full of world publishing events that I somehow can't figure out how to get off my hands. And a heck of a lot of people read celebrity magazines. Well, maybe, said Rick, we could run over how you see this working practically. First off, we need it wrapped up in a month, said Maddox. That's Marty's view as well as mine. A month, I repeated. You want a book in a month? And everything will have to be done in the States, said Kroll. Adam's completely locked into a lecture tour there right now, and a fundraising program for his foundation. I don't see him coming back to the UK till March at the earliest. I nodded slowly. I suppose I can always bring the manuscript back here to work on. The manuscript stays in America, said Kroll flatly. That's one of the reasons Marty made the house on the Vineyard available. It's a secure environment. Only a few people are allowed to handle it.
It sounds more like a bomb than a book,
joked Quigley. Nobody laughed. He rubbed his hands unhappily.
You know, I will need to see it myself at some point. I am supposed to be editing it.
In theory, said Maddox. Actually, we need to talk about that later. He turned to Kroll. We'll need to revise as we go. As they carried on discussing the timetable, I studied Quigley. He was upright but motionless, like one of those victims in the movies who gets stuck with a stiletto while standing in a crowd and dies without anyone noticing. Yet even at the time, I realized he'd asked a perfectly reasonable question. If he was the editor, why shouldn't he see the manuscript? And why did it have to be held in a secure environment on an island off the eastern seaboard of the USA? I felt Rick's elbow in my ribs and realized Maddox was talking to me. How soon can you get over there? Assuming we go with you, rather than one of the others. How fast can you move?
It's Friday today, I said. Give me a day to get ready. I can fly Sunday.
And start Monday? That will be great. Maddox and Kroll outside the terminal. Vast lines of passengers queued to be frisked and x-rayed, carrying their shoes in one hand and their pathetic toiletries in a clear plastic bag in the other. A satellite news channel was burbling away in the corner of the American Airlines lounge. No one was watching. I fixed myself a double espresso and was just turning to the football reports in one of the tabloids when I heard the words Adam Lang. 3 days earlier, I would have taken no notice. But now it was as if my own name was being called out. I went and stood in front of the screen and tried to make sense of the story. To begin with, it sounded like old news. 4 British citizens had been picked up in Pakistan a few years back, kidnapped by the CIA, according to their lawyer, taken to a secret military installation in Eastern Europe, and tortured. The new twist, apparently, was that a Sunday paper had obtained a leaked Ministry of Defence document which seemed to suggest that Lang had ordered an SAS unit to seize the men and hand them over to the CIA. Various expressions of outrage followed. A spokeswoman for Lang was quoted as saying the former Prime Minister knew nothing of the reports and was refusing to comment. A short time later, they announced the Boston flight was boarding. I love that moment when a grabbed dray landscape flickers out of sight beneath you, and the plane tunnels up through the clouds to burst into the sunshine. I had a drink, I watched a movie. I dozed for a while, but I must admit I also scoured that business-class cabin for every Sunday newspaper I could find, ignored the sports pages for once, and read all that had been written about Adam Lang and those 4 suspected terrorists. We made our final approach to Logan Airport at 1 PM local time. As we came in low over Boston Harbor, the sun we had been chasing all day struck the downtown skyscrapers one after the other, erupting columns of white and blue, gold and silver, a firework display in glass and steel. When I was through immigration, I turned on my phone. It showed a welcoming message from Lang's personal assistant, someone named Amelia Bly, apologizing for not providing a driver to collect me from the airport. Instead, she suggested I take a bus to the ferry terminal at Woods Hole and promised a car would meet me when I landed at Martha's Vineyard. We came into the ferry terminal at Vineyard Haven just before 7. By then, I'd been travelling for 17 hours. I didn't know where I was or which landscape I was passing through. The taxi driver didn't utter a word the whole journey, just scrutinized me in the mirror. I could see nothing except my reflection in the cold darkness of the window. After a while, we turned left into what I guessed must be Edgartown, and not long after that, we pulled up outside the Lighthouse View Hotel. I can picture the scene in summer. Buckets and spades and fishing nets on the veranda, sandals by the door. A dusting of white sand trailed up from the beach. But out of season, the big old wooden hotel creaked in the wind like a sailing boat stuck on a reef. Inside, a girl dressed up as a Victorian maid handed me a message from Lang's office. I would be picked up at 10 the next morning and should bring my passport to show security. I was starting to feel like a man on a mystery tour. As soon as I reached one location, I was given a fresh set of instructions to proceed to the next. The taxi driver picked me up from the hotel next morning. Because I'd been booked into a hotel in Edgartown, I'd assumed that Reinhardt's property must be somewhere in the port itself. Instead, we drove out of town for about 10 minutes into flat, thickly wooded country, and then, before I'd even noticed a gap in the trees, swung left down an unmade sandy track until we came to a closed gate, and there materialized a man carrying a clipboard and wearing the unmistakable dark Crombie overcoat and polished black Oxfords of a British plainclothes copper. I wound down my window and handed him my passport. He scowled as he checked my name against the list on his clipboard. Then the gate swung clear, the track curved, and we drew up at the house. From somewhere inside, I heard a door slam, and an elegant blonde in a dark blue jacket and skirt, carrying an A4 black and red hardcover notebook, came clicking down the corridor on high heels. "Amelia Bly," she said with a fixed smile. I presumed she was the spokeswoman mentioned in that morning's Times. "Adam's in New York, unfortunately, and won't be back till later this afternoon. Come and have a cup of coffee. I'll show you where we work." I followed her into the interior, trailing in her cloud of scent. She had very nice legs, I noticed, as she walked. The house was arranged so that all the bedrooms were on the ground floor, with the living space above, and the moment we ascended into the huge open sitting room, I understood why. The wall facing the coast was entirely made of glass. There was nothing man-made within sight, just ocean, lake, and sky. "We're in here," said Amelia, opening a door. She produced a key from the pocket of her well-cut jacket and unlocked a big gunmetal filing cabinet from which she withdrew a box file. "This is not to be removed from this room," she said, laying it on the desk. "It's not to be copied. You can make notes, but I must remind you that you've signed a confidentiality agreement. You have 6 hours to read it before Adam gets in from New York." All good books are different, but all bad books are exactly the same. And what they all have in common is that they don't ring true. I'm not saying that a good book is true, necessarily, just that it feels true for the time you're reading it. Adam Lang's memoir failed the test. It consisted of 16 chapters arranged chronologically, early years, into politics, challenge for the leadership, and so on. Each chapter was between 10 and 20,000 words long and hadn't been written so much as bolted together from speeches, official minutes, communiques, memoranda, interview transcripts, office diaries, party manifestos, and newspaper articles. Occasionally, Lang permitted himself a private emotion or a personal observation, but not very often, and not to any great effect. And where was his wife? I wondered. She was barely mentioned. It was strictly accurate, and yet overall it was a lie. It had to be, I thought. No human being could pass through life and feel so little. Especially Adam Lang, whose political stock in trade was emotional empathy. No wonder Macara had thrown himself off the Martha's Vineyard ferry. No wonder Maddox and Kroll had flown to London to try to rescue the project. No wonder they were paying me $50,000 a week. All these seemingly bizarre events were rendered entirely logical by the direness of the manuscript. I took a gulp, literally and metaphorically, and began reading again from the top. I finished the last of the 621 pages in mid-afternoon, and when I laid down the manuscript, I pressed my hands to my cheeks and opened my mouth and eyes wide in a reasonable imitation of Edvard Munch's The Scream. That was when I heard a cough in the doorway. I looked up to see Ruth Lang watching me. "As bad as that," she said. She was wearing a man's thick, shapeless white sweater, so long in the sleeves that only her chewed fingernails were visible. And once we got downstairs, she pulled on top of this a pale blue cagoule, disappearing for a while as she tugged it over her head. Her short, dark hair stuck up in Medusa's spikes. It was she who had proposed a walk. She said I looked as though I needed one, which was true enough. She found me her husband's windproof jacket and a pair of boots belonging to the house, and together we stepped out into the blustery Atlantic air. "So how bad is it?" she said. "You haven't read it." "Not all of it." "Well," I said politely, "it needs some work." She had pulled up her hood. I couldn't really see her face, only the sharp white tip of her nose was visible. Everyone said she was smarter than her husband and that she'd loved their life at the top even more than he had. Now she stopped and turned to face the ocean, her hands thrust deep into her pockets. "You were my idea," she said. "I was?" "Yes, you wrote Christie's book for him." It took me a moment to work out who she meant. Christy Costello. I hadn't thought of him in a long while. He was my first bestseller. The intimate memoirs of a 70s rock star. "You know Christy?" It seemed so unlikely. "We stayed at his house on Mustique last winter. I read his memoirs. They were by the bed. And now I'm embarrassed." "No, why? They were brilliant, in a horrible kind of way. Listening to his scrambled stories over dinner, and then seeing how you'd turn them into something resembling a life. I said to Adam then, this is the man you need to write your book." She pulled back her hood and took a deep breath. She was better looking in the flesh than she was on television. The camera hated her almost as much as it loved her husband. It didn't catch her amused alertness, the animation of her face. "God, I miss home," she said. "I keep telling him it's like being married to Napoleon on St. Helena." "Well, then why don't you go back to London?" She didn't say anything for a while, just stared at the ocean, biting her lip. Then she looked at me, sizing me up. "You did sign that confidentiality agreement?" "Of course. Because I don't want to read about this in some gossip column next week." "Whoa," I said, "I thought you just said I was your idea. I didn't ask to come here." She nodded. "All right. Then I'll tell you why I can't go home. Between you and me, because there's something not quite right with him at the moment, and I'm a bit afraid to leave him." Boy, I thought, this just gets better and better. "Yes," I replied diplomatically. "Amelia told me he was very upset by Mike's death." "Oh, she did she? Quite when Mrs. Bligh became such an expert about my husband's emotional state, I'm not sure. If she had hissed and sprung claws, she couldn't have made her feelings plainer. No, it isn't just that. It's losing power. That's the real trouble. Losing power, and now having to sit down and relive everything year by year. While all the time the press are going on and on about what he did and didn't do. He can't get free of the past, you see. He can't move on. She gestured helplessly at the sea, the sand, the dunes. He's stuck. We're both stuck. As we walked back to the house, she put her arm through mine. "Oh dear," she said, "you must be starting to wonder what you've let yourself in for." There was a lot more activity in the compound when we got back. A dark green Jaguar limousine with a Washington license plate was parked at the entrance, and a black minivan with darkened windows was drawn up behind it. As the front door opened, I could hear several telephones ringing at once. A genial, grey-haired man was sitting just inside, drinking a cup of tea, talking to one of the police guards. He jumped up smartly when he saw Ruth Lang. "Afternoon, ma'am." "Hello, Jeff. How was New York?" "Bloody chaos, as usual. Like Piccadilly Circus in the rush hour. Thought for a while I wouldn't get back in time." Ruth turned to me. "They like to have the car in position when Adam lands." She began the long process of wriggling out of her cagoule, just as Amelia Bligh came round the corner, a cell phone wedged between her elegant shoulder and her sculpted chin. That's fine, I'll tell him." She nodded to Ruth and carried on speaking. "On Thursday he's in Chicago." Then looked at Jeff and tapped her wristwatch. "Actually, I think I'll go to the airport," said Ruth, suddenly pulling her cagoule back down. "Amelia can stay here and polish her nails or something. Why don't you come?" she added to me. "He's keen to meet you." "He's the most charming man you'll ever meet. My own Prince Charming." And she gave her deep-throated, mannish laugh. I glanced over my shoulder at the unmarked minivan following close behind. I could see how this was addictive. I was getting used to it already. Being forced to give it up after it had become a habit would be like letting go of Mummy. But thanks to terrorism, Lang would never have to give it up, never have to stand in line for public transport, never even drive himself. He was as pampered and cocooned as a Romanov before the revolution. We came out of the forest onto the main road, turned left, and almost immediately swung right through the airport perimeter. I stared out of the window in surprise at the big runway. "We're here already." "When summer, Marty likes to leave his office in Manhattan at 4, said Ruth, "and be on the beach by 6. "I suppose he has a private jet," I said in an attempt at knowingness. "Of course he has a private jet." She gave me a look which made me feel like a hick who'd just used his fish knife to butter his roll. Of course he has a private jet. You don't own a $30 million house and travel to it by bus. The man must have a carbon footprint the size of a Yeti's. I realised then that just about everybody the Langs knew these days had a private jet. Indeed, here came Lang himself, in a corporate Gulfstream, dropping out of the darkening sky and skimming in low over the darkening pines. The driver put his foot down, and a minute later we pulled up outside the little terminal. The plane taxied in from the runway. It was painted dark blue and looked bigger than the usual CEO's phallic symbol, with a high tail and 6 windows either side. When it came to a stop and the engines were cut, the silence over the little airfield was unexpectedly profound. The door opened, the steps were lowered, and out came a couple of special branch men. Lang himself seemed in no hurry to disembark. I could just make him out in the shadows of the interior, shaking hands with the pilot. And finally, almost reluctantly, it seemed to me, he came out and paused at the top of the steps. He glanced round as if he were trying to remember what he was supposed to do. It was on the edge of becoming embarrassing when he caught sight of us watching him through the big glass window. He pointed and waved and grinned in exactly the way he had in his heyday, and the moment, whatever it was, had passed. We left the window just in time to meet him as he came in through the arrivals gate. "Hi, darling," he said, and stooped to kiss his wife. He noticed me. "Hello," he said. "Who are you?" "I'm your ghost," I said. I regretted it the instant I said it. I conceived it as a witty, self-deprecatory, break-the-ice kind of line, but somehow out there in that deserted airport, amid the greyness and the quietness, it hit precisely the wrong note. "Right," he said doubtfully. And although he shook my hand, he also drew his head back slightly, as if to inspect me from a safer distance. "Don't worry," Ruth told him. "He isn't always such a jerk." It was dark by the time I got back to the house, and the temperature had dropped with the sun. I stood beside the minivan and watched as Lang ducked out of his car and was swept through the door by a swirl of bodyguards and staff. I stayed outside in the cold, still twisting with embarrassment over my gaffe at the airport. To my surprise, the person who realised I was missing and who came out to fetch me was Lang. "What on earth are you doing out here?" he called from the doorway. "Isn't anybody looking after you? Come and have a drink." He steered me towards the room where I'd had coffee that morning. "So you have to be me for a month. God help you," he said. "Well, I hope it will be a fairly painless procedure for both of us," I said, and hesitated, unsure how to address him. "Adam," he said. "Call me Adam." "So," he went on, "how exactly are we supposed to go about this? I'll interview you, I'll turn your answers into prose. I might have to add linking passages, trying to imitate your voice. And how long will this take? Full time. I think if we work really hard, we should be able to break the back of it in a week." "A week?" I resisted the temptation to point out that $10 million for a week's work wasn't exactly the national minimum wage. "I may need to come back to you to plug any holes, but if you can give me till Friday, I'll have enough to rewrite most of this draft. The important thing is we start tomorrow." I'd anticipated that my biggest problem on the first day would be physically getting Adam Lang into a room and keeping him there for long enough to start interviewing him. The strange thing was that when I reached the house, he was already waiting for me. "Hi," he said, looking up. "Ready to start?" "I've loaded the manuscript onto this flash drive for you," said Amelia. "You're welcome to copy it onto your own computer, but I'm afraid that if you do, your laptop must stay here, locked up overnight." Lang said, "So you've actually got my whole book on that?" "We could get 100 books on that, Adam," said Amelia patiently. "Amazing." He shook his head. "You know, the worst thing about my life, you get so out of touch. You never go in a shop, everything's done for you. You don't carry any money. If I want some money, even now, I have to ask one of the secretaries or one of the protection boys to get it for me. I couldn't do it myself anyway. I don't know my, what are they called? PIN? You see, I just don't have a clue." He threw up his arms and grinned. "This," I said excitedly, "it is exactly the sort of detail we need to put in your book. Nobody knows this sort of thing." Lang looked startled. "I can't put that in. People would think I'm a complete idiot." "But it's human detail, I mean it. Let's tell people what it really feels like to be Prime Minister, not just the policy stuff. Who cares about policy? What fascinates people is always people. That's why you need me. This shouldn't be a book for political hacks. This should be a book for everyone." "The people's memoir," said Amelia dryly, but I ignored her. "Do you mind," I asked, "if I start recording?" Lang shrugged. As I pressed record, Amelia slipped out and closed the door quietly behind her. "The first thing that strikes me," I said, "is that you aren't really a politician at all, in the conventional sense, even though you've been so amazingly successful. I mean, when you were growing up, no one would have expected you to become a politician, would they?" "No," said Lang, "not at all. I had absolutely no interest in politics, either as a child or as a teenager. I thought people who were obsessed by politics were weird. I still do, as a matter of fact. I like playing football, I like theatre and the movies. And a bit later on, I like going out with girls. I never dreamt I might become a politician. Most student politicians struck me as complete nerds." Bingo, I thought. We'd only been working 2 minutes, and already we had a potential opening for the book right there. "So, what changed? What turned you on to politics?" "Turned on is about right," said Lang with a laugh. "I'd left Cambridge, and drifted for a year, really, hoping that a play I'd been involved in might get taken up by a theatre in London. But it didn't happen, and so I ended up working in a bank, living in this grotty basement flat in Lambeth, feeling very sorry for myself. And I remember it was a Sunday afternoon, raining, and someone starts knocking at the door. It was a story he must have told 1,000 times, but you wouldn't have guessed it, watching him that morning. He was sitting back at his chair, smiling at the memory, going over the same old words, using the same rehearsed gestures, and I thought what an old trooper he was. The sort of pro who'd always make an effort to put on a good show, whether he had an audience of 1 or 1 million. And this person just wouldn't go away. And I'd had a bit to drink the night before, and what have you, and I'm moaning and groaning. I've got the pillow over my head, but it starts up again. Knock, knock, knock. So eventually I get out of bed, and I open the door, and there's this gorgeous girl. She's wringing wet from the rain, but she launches into this speech about the local elections. And so I invite her in. I make her a cup of tea, and she dries off, and that's it. I'm in love. And it quickly becomes clear that the best way of getting to see her again is to turn up the next Tuesday evening, or whenever it is, and join the local party, which I do. And this is Ruth. This is Ruth. And if she'd been a member of a different political party, I'd have gone along and joined it just the same. I wouldn't have stayed in it, he added quickly. I mean, obviously, this was the start of a long political awakening for me, but everything would have been different if Ruth hadn't knocked on that door that afternoon and kept knocking. We worked all morning without a break, except for when a tape was filled. Then I would briefly hurry downstairs to hand it over to be transcribed. I took him carefully through his early years, focusing on the impressions and physical objects of his childhood, the semi-detached home on a housing estate in Leicester, the personalities of his father, a builder, and his mother, a teacher, the quiet, apolitical values of the English provinces in the 60s, where the only sounds to be heard on a Sunday were church bells and the chimes of ice cream vans, the muddy Saturday morning games of football at the local park, and the long summer afternoons of cricket down by the river. Sitting there in Reinhardt's study, the minutiae of English life, nearly half a century earlier, seemed as remote as bric-a-brac in a Victorian trompe-l'oeil, and you might have thought about as relevant, but there was cunning in my method, and Lang, with his genius for empathy, grasped it at once. What we need to do, I told him, is to persuade the reader to identify emotionally with Adam Lang, because if I know nothing else about this business, I know this: once you have the reader's sympathy, they'll follow you anywhere. We swapped memories for hour after hour, and I will not say we began to concoct a childhood for Lang exactly, but we certainly pooled our experiences to such an extent that a few of my memories inevitably became blended into his. We decided that his first memory would be when he tried to run away from home at the age of 3, and he heard the sound of his father's footsteps coming up behind him and his muscled arms as he scooped him back to the house. We remembered his mother ironing and the smell of wet clothes on a wooden frame drying in front of a coal fire, and how he liked to pretend that the clothes horse was a house. We remembered Christmas pantomimes he had been to, and his stage debut in the school nativity play. Was I a wise man? Well, that sounds a little smug. A sheep. Not smug enough. A guiding star. Perfect. When we broke for lunch and Lang went off to play tennis with one of his bodyguards, I dropped by the downstairs office to check on the transcription. For the first time since arriving on the island, I felt the warm breath of optimism. "This is all new to me," said Amelia, who was bent over Lucy's shoulder reading Lang's words as they unfurled across the screen. "I've never heard him mention any of this before." "The human memory is a treasure house, Amelia," I said, deadpan. "It's merely a matter of finding the right key." I left her peering at the screen and went back upstairs, still clutching my silent phone. I had had an idea, and my newborn confidence gave me the courage to act on it. I went into the study and closed the door. I plugged Amelia's flash drive into my laptop. Then I attached a cable from the computer to my cell phone and dialed up the internet. The moment I was online, I addressed an email to myself, attached the manuscript file, and pressed send. The upload seemed to take an age. Amelia started calling my name from downstairs. I glanced at the door, and suddenly my fingers were thick and clumsy with anxiety. "Your file has been transferred," said the female voice, which for some reason is favoured by my internet service provider. "You have email," she announced a fraction later. Immediately I yanked the cable out of the laptop and had just removed the flash drive when somewhere in the big house a klaxon started. At the same time there was a hum and a rattle above the window behind me, and I spun round to see a heavy metal shutter dropping from the ceiling. I groped for the door, and when I flung it open, the unfiltered sound of the siren was strong enough to vibrate my stomach. I heard footsteps coming up the steps, and then a sabre of light flashed into the big room. "Sorry, sir," came a policeman's voice from the darkness. "I didn't realise there was anyone up there." It was a drill. They held it once a week. Lockdown, I think they called it. And as the shutters rose, and the pale wash of Atlantic light was released back into the house, Amelia came into the living room to apologise for not having warned me. "It must have made you jump." "You could say that." "A word of advice." Her glossy pink lips parted in a smile, but her big, clear blue eyes were as cold as crystal. "Don't go wandering around too much on your own. The security boys don't like it." car on the way. I didn't argue, I couldn't. She'd gone. I pulled back the curtains to unveil a sky and sea as grey as death. Nothing was stirring. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard the sound of an engine. I looked down and saw a couple of cars pull up. The doors of the first opened and 2 young men got out, young, fit-looking, wearing ski jackets, jeans and boots. The driver stared up at my window, and instinctively I took a step backwards. By the time I risked a second look, he had opened the rear of the car and was taking out a television camera. I started to move quickly then, showered, shaved, put on clean clothes and packed. By the time I got down to reception, the hotel looked as if it was staging an international media convention. I passed, unnoticed, through the crowds and went outside to the veranda. The minivan took me up the hill, out of Edgartown and into the flat countryside. As we approached the Reinhardt compound, the driver leaned in close to the windscreen. Here we go again. Up ahead, it looked as though there had been a traffic accident. The vivid blue lights of a couple of patrol cars flashed dramatically in the gloomy morning. People were standing around aimlessly, and I assumed that they had been in a pileup. But as the minivan slowed and indicated to turn left, the bystanders started grabbing things from beside the road and came running at us. "Lang! Lang! Lang!" a woman shouted over a bullhorn. "Liar! Liar! Liar!" Images of Lang in an orange jumpsuit, gripping prison bars with bloodied hands, danced in front of the windscreen. "Wanted war criminal, Adam Lang." "They're always the really violent bastards," said my driver. "Peace protesters." He put his foot down. The rear tyres slithered uselessly, then bit, and we shot forwards into the silent woods. Amelia met me in the passage, and I trailed behind her around to the back of the house. "I tried to call you several times last night," she said, "but you didn't answer." "What did you want to tell me?" "This." She stopped outside a door, opened it, and stood aside to let me go in. The room was in darkness, but there was just enough light for me to make out the shape of a double bed. It smelled of stale clothes and old lady's soap. "You'll be sleeping in here from now on." I tried to make a joke of it. "Is this where you put the granny?" "No, this is where we put Mike Macara." I've never been particularly superstitious, but I do believe that certain places have an atmosphere, and from the moment I stepped into that room I didn't like it. The thought of touching Macara's clothes filled me with something close to panic. "Look," she said, "we're due to get the ICC announcement in less than 30 minutes. Why don't you settle in here, then come up and join us? Whatever's decided will affect you. You're practically one of us now." "I am?" "Of course. You drafted the statement yesterday. That makes you an accomplice." Down below, I heard the noise of the minivan pulling up outside the front of the house. There was a commotion of voices in the hall, and then a small army of footsteps thudding up the wooden staircase. I reckon that must be the sound of $1,000 an hour in legal fees on the hoof. I gave Kroll and his client a couple of minutes for handshakes, condolences, and general expressions of confidence, then wearily left my dead man's room and went up to join them. Kroll had flown in by private jet from Washington with 2 young paralegals, an exquisitely pretty Mexican woman he introduced as Encarnacion, and a black guy from New York called Josh. "So here's the score," said Kroll, when we'd all taken our places. "You're not being charged, you're not being arrested. All that the prosecutor is asking for right now is permission to launch a formal investigation. So when you go out of here, you walk tall, you look cool, and you have peace in your heart, because it's all going to be fine." "The president told me he thought they might not even let her investigate," said Lang. "I hesitate to contradict the leader of the free world," said Kroll, "but the general feeling in Washington this morning is they'll have to. Madam Prosecutor is quite a savvy operator, it seems. The British government have consistently refused to hold an investigation of their own, which gives her a legal pretext to look at it herself. What am I likely to be investigated for?" Kroll gestured to Encarnacion. "Either crimes against humanity," she said carefully, "or war crimes." There was a silence. Odd, the effect such words can have. "Unbelievable," said Ruth eventually, "to equate what Adam did or didn't do with the Nazis. That's precisely why the United States doesn't recognize the court, said Kroll. He wagged his finger. We warned you what would happen. An international war crimes tribunal sounds very noble in principle. But you go after all these genocidal maniacs in the Third World, and sooner or later the Third World is going to come right back after you. Otherwise it looks like discrimination. Well, they can't drag America into their phony court. So who can they drag? It's obvious. Our closest ally, you. It's not legal, it's political. Ruth was concentrating hard, and now she shook her head emphatically. No, Sid, it's legal as well. Richard Reichart has produced documentary evidence which suggests that Adam did, in fact, do all those things, aided, abetted, and facilitated. She looked up. This is legal jeopardy, and that leads inescapably to political jeopardy. Well, if it's any comfort, Adam's certainly not in jeopardy as long as he stays here among his friends. Wait a minute, said Lang, raising his hand to his head and clutching his hair, as if he were glimpsing the situation for the first time. Are you saying that I can't leave the United States? Until this whole thing is resolved, said Kroll, I do strongly advise you not to travel to any country that recognizes the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. But just about every country in the world recognizes the ICC, said Lang. America doesn't. And who else? Iraq, said Josh. China. North Korea. Indonesia. We waited for him to go on. He didn't. Amelia aimed the remote at the television. I think something's happening, she said. I'd never witnessed any of my authors at a real crisis in their lives before, and scrutinizing Lang, I gradually began to realize that the question, how did it feel, was a crude tool. In the course of those few minutes, a rapid succession of emotions swept across Lang's face. Shock, fury, hurt, defiance, dismay, shame. How were these to be disentangled? And if he didn't know precisely what he was feeling now, how could he be expected to remember in 10 years' time? The chief prosecutor finished her statement, and the screen reverted to the aerial shot of Reinhardt's house in its setting of woods, pond, and ocean, as the world waited for Lang to appear. Downstairs, the phones started ringing. We should get you to Washington, said Kroll. My plane's waiting at the airport. Lang was still staring at the screen. When Marty said I could use his vacation house, I never realized how cut off this place was. Oh, we should never have come. Now we look as though we're hiding. Exactly my feeling, said Kroll. You can't just hole up here. I made some calls. I can get you in to see the House Majority Leader at lunchtime. We can have a photo up with the Secretary of State this afternoon. With Lang and the others gone, the house seemed not merely empty, but bereft of purpose. I recognized I was now at a decisive point. Either I continued to hang around the edges of this floundering project, or I could seize control of it myself, knock these 621 pages into some kind of publishable shape, take my 250 grand and head off to lie on a beach somewhere until I had forgotten all about the Langs. Put in those terms, it wasn't a choice. I picked up Makara's manuscript to remind myself of how not to begin a $10 million autobiography. Chapter 1. Early Years. Langs are Scottish folk originally, and proud of it. Our name is a derivation of long, the old English word for tall, and it is from the north of the border that my forefathers hail. God help us, I ran my pen through it. If you want a family tree, go to a garden centre. That's what I advise my clients. Nobody else is interested. I turned my attention to the interview transcripts. I knew what I wanted. It was there in our first session. If I tidied up the grammar, the account of how Ruth had canvassed Lang for the local elections and so drawn him into politics would make a perfect opening. I rested my fingers on the keys of my laptop and started to type. I became a politician out of love. Not love for any particular party or ideology, but love for a woman who came knocking on my door one wet Sunday afternoon. I carried on for a couple of hours until about 1 o'clock or so, then turned to face my room. I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to clear away Makara's clothes. Taking a deep breath, I slid open the doors to the closet and reached up to the shelf above the clothes rail to pull down his suitcase. It hit the floor with a thud, and the catches flew up with a loud and simultaneous snap. Inside was a single large padded envelope addressed to M. Makara, Esquire. A label on the back showed it had come from the Adam Lang Archive Centre in Cambridge. I turned it over in my hands for a second, then opened it, and pulled out a handful of photographs and photocopies. The photocopies were of various footlights programmes and theatre reviews from Cambridge, plus a lot of local newspaper reports of the Greater London Council elections of May 1977, and Lang's original party membership card. It was only when I saw the date on the card that I rocked back on my heels. It was from 1975, 2 years before Ruth had come knocking on the door. I was more irritated than anything. It certainly didn't strike me as sinister. Everybody tends to heighten their own reality, and I could see how it would have suited Lang to pretend he'd only gone into politics because he fancied a girl. I turned my attention back to the Cambridge material. The biggest of the photographs showed 8 young people grouped together under a spotlight, their arms outstretched, as if they'd just finished some show-stopping song and dance routine in a cabaret. Lang was on the far right, wearing a striped blazer, a bow tie and a straw boater. Glued to the back was a typed slip listing the names of the performers along with their colleges. There was a copyright stamp, Cambridge Evening News, in the bottom left-hand corner, and scrawled diagonally next to it, in blue biro, was a telephone number. No doubt Makara, indefatigable fact hound that he was, had hunted down one of the cast, and I wondered which one of them it was, and if he or she could remember the events depicted in the photographs. Purely on a whim, I took out my mobile and dialed the number. I let it ring for a long while. Just as I was about to give up, a man answered, cautiously. Richard Reichardt? I hung up at once. In fact, I was so alarmed, I actually threw the phone onto the bed. It lay there for about 30 seconds, and then it started to ring. I darted over and grabbed it. The incoming number was withheld and quickly switched it off. Suddenly, I couldn't rid my mind of the image of Makara's heavy body rolling back and forth in the surf. I went downstairs to find the housekeeper. "Excuse me, Deb." "Yes, sir. Do you happen to know if there's a map of the island I could borrow?" Past few hours erecting some kind of installation, low wooden boards on which had been mounted hundreds of terrible images, torn from magazines and newspapers, of burned children, tortured corpses, beheaded hostages, and bomb-flattened neighbourhoods. A banner ran across the top, as over a stall at a church jumble sale, "For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive." I turned past it into the traffic and cycled on, aware that I would soon lose the light. The sky was threatening, a wind was getting up, and about 2 miles later, as I turned towards the sea, it started to rain, hard, cold pellets that exploded on my hands and face and carried the scent of the sea in them. 1 minute they were plopping sporadically in the pond, the next the rain was sweeping down in torrents. I dismounted, propped the bike against a fence, and ran up the cinder path past a flagpole to the veranda of the house. A moment later the door opened, and an old-timer of not far off 90, to judge by the liver spots and the stoop, appeared. I made a stammering apology for disturbing his privacy, but he soon cut me off. "You're British," he said, squinting at me. "I am.
That's okay, you can shelter. Sheltering's free. You anything to do with this fellow Lang?
In a way, I said.
Seems intelligent. Why do you want to get himself mixed up with that damn fool in the White House?
That's what everyone would like to know.
War crimes, he said with a roll of his head.
We leaned on the weathered handrail and stared out together at the rain.
And what brings you to this part of the Vineyard?
There seemed no point in lying. Someone I knew was washed up on the beach down there, I said. I thought I'd take a look at the spot to pay my respects.
Now that was a funny business, he said. No way should that current have carried him this far west, not at this time of year.
What? I turned to look at him.
I've known this sea most of my life. Hell, a guy tried to throw me off that damn ferry when I was still at the World Bank. I can tell you this, if he'd succeeded, I wouldn't have floated ashore in Lambert's Cove.
I was conscious of a drumming in my ears, but whether it was my blood or the downpour hitting the shingle roof, I couldn't tell. Did you mention this to the police?
The police, young man, at my age, I have better things to do with what little time I have left than spend it with the police. I told Annabeth. She was the one who was dealing with the police.
He saw my blank expression.
She told the police about the lights. The lights on the beach on the night the body was washed up.
I stared at him. Do you think you could point me in the direction of Annabeth's house?
Sure, he said, but there's not much point in going there.
Why not?
She fell downstairs 2 weeks ago, been in a coma ever since. Hey,
he shouted, but by then I was halfway down the steps from the veranda. Thanks for the shelter, I called over my shoulder. I've got to get going. I righted the bike and set off down the track. Could it be true? I thought of Makara alone on this immense shore, face down, glutted with salt water, his cheap winter clothes stiff with brine and cold. I imagined him emerging out of the bleak dawn, carried in on the tide from Vineyard Sound, scraping the sand with his big feet, being washed out again and then returning, slowly creeping higher up the beach until at last he grounded. And then I imagined him dumped over the side of a dinghy and dragged ashore by men with flashlights, who'd come back a few days later and thrown a garrulous old witness down her architect-designed stairs. A few hundred yards along the beach, a pair of figures emerged from the dunes and started walking towards me, dark and tiny and frail amid all that raging nature. The tall one was a man, the short one a woman. The short one was Ruth Lang.
"Dep told me you were here,"
she called into the wind.
"We came to fetch you back before the storm started."
The first thing I did when we got back was run a hot bath. While it was filling, I peeled off my wet clothes. Naturally, a house as modern as Reinhardt's didn't have anything so crudely useful as a radiator, so I left them where they fell and stepped into the large tub. I let myself slide right down until only my nostrils were above the surface, and lay there like some basking alligator in its steamy lagoon for several minutes. I suppose that's why I didn't hear anyone knock on my bedroom door, and only became aware that someone was next door when I broke the surface. I'd heard them moving around. "Hello?" I called.
"Sorry,"
Ruth called back.
"I did knock, it's me. I was just bringing you some dry clothes."
"Well, there's no need," I began.
"Dinner's in an hour, is that okay?"
"That's fine," I said, surrendering. "Thank you." When I went upstairs, Ruth was sitting on the same sofa in the same position she had adopted that morning, with her legs drawn up beneath her, reading the New York Review of Books. I sat down opposite her.
"We'll eat in 20 minutes, she said, "but first, we must watch the news. Here comes Adam."
The headline behind the newsreader's shoulder read, "Lang, War Crimes." I didn't like the fact that they weren't bothering to use a question mark anymore. The familiar scenes from the morning unfolded. Then came shots of Lang in Washington. Amelia Bligh clearly visible in the background. I didn't dare look at Ruth.
"Adam Lang," said the Secretary of State, "has stood by our side in the war against terror, and I am proud to stand by his side this afternoon and to offer him, on behalf of the American people, the hand of friendship. Adam, good to see you."
"Don't grin," said Ruth.
"Thank you," said Adam, grinning and shaking the proffered hand. He beamed at the cameras.
He looked like an eager student collecting a prize on speech day. "Thank you very much. It's good to see you." "Oh, for God's sake," said Ruth. The news bulletin moved on to a report about a suicide bombing in the Middle East, and Ruth turned off the television. At once, her mobile phone started ringing. She glanced at it. "It's Adam, calling to ask how I think it went." She turned that off as well. Let him sweat. "Come on, let's eat." The long table by the window had been laid for two. Depp brought in 2 bowls of clear soup, and for a while we clinked our spoons in self-conscious silence. "How's it going?" she said eventually. "The book, it's not, to be honest." "Why is that, apart from the obvious reason?" I hesitated. "I find it difficult to understand him." "Oh?" Over the rim of her glass, her dark eyes gave me one of her double-barreled shotgun looks. "In what way?" "I can't understand why this good-looking 18-year-old lad who goes to Cambridge without the slightest interest in politics, who spends his time acting and drinking and chasing girls, suddenly ends up a member of a political party." "Didn't you ask him?" "He told me he joined because of you, that he followed you into politics out of love, essentially, and I can relate to that. It ought to be true." "But it isn't?" "Well, you know it isn't. He was a party member for at least a year before he even met you." She wrinkled her forehead and sipped some more water. "But that story he always tells about what drew him into politics, I do have a distinct memory of that episode, because I canvassed in the London elections of 77, and I definitely knocked on his door, so there has to be a grain of truth in it." "A grain," I conceded. "Maybe he'd joined in 75, but then met you and became more active. It still doesn't answer the basic question of what took him into a political party in the first place." "How do you know he joined in 75? I had a moment's alarm that I'd said too much, but there seemed no reason not to tell her. "Mike Macara found Adam's original party membership card in the Cambridge archives." She laughed. "Typical Mike, to ruin a good story by too much research. Why don't you show me what he dug out? It might jog my memory." I went down to my room and retrieved Macara's package. I watched intently as Ruth sorted through the photographs and programs, saw the hard lines soften as she picked out a photograph of Lang in his striped blazer on a dappled riverbank. "Oh, look at him," she said. "Isn't he pretty?" She held it up next to her cheek. "Irresistible," I said. She inspected the picture more closely. "My God, look at them. It was another world, wasn't it? I mean, what was happening while this was being taken? Vietnam, the Cold War, the first miners' strike in Britain since 1926, the military coup in Chile. And what do? They get a bottle of champagne and they go punting. I'll drink to that. What's this telephone number?" I should have known that nothing would escape her. She showed me the photograph with the number written on the back. I didn't reply. I could feel my face beginning to flush. "It's Richard Reichardt's." She stared at me for a while, as if we were playing a game of truth or dare. Then she reached over, took my phone, and entered the 14 digits. She raised it to her ear and stared at me again. About 30 seconds later, a flicker of alarm passed across her face. She fumbled to press the disconnect button and put the phone back on the table. "When did you discover this?" "Earlier today, when I moved into Macara's room." "And then you went to Lambert's Cove to look at where his body came ashore." "That's right." She stood. "I'm going for a walk." "But it's 9 o'clock at night," I protested. "It's pouring with rain." "It'll clear my head." "I'll come with you." "No. Thanks, but I need to think things through on my own." "You stay here and have another drink. You look as though you need one." It was the poor bloody copper I felt sorry for. No doubt he'd been downstairs with his feet up in front of the television looking forward to a quiet night in, and suddenly here was Lady Macbeth again, off on yet another of her ceaseless walks, this time in the middle of an Atlantic storm. I stood at the window and watched them cross the lawn, towards the silently raging vegetation. I suddenly felt overwhelmingly tired. My legs were stiff from cycling. I felt shivery with an incipient cold. I put the photographs and photocopies away in the envelope and went downstairs to my room. When I took off my clothes and switched off the light, sleep seemed to swallow me instantly. Some while later I surfaced to find the room in darkness, apart from a vertical strip of light to my left. Can I come in? Still groggy from my dreams, I turned on the bedside light. The day before Mike died, he and Adam had a terrible row, she said, without preliminaries. I haven't told anyone this before, not even the police. What was it about? I don't know, but it was furious, terminal. And they never spoke again. When I asked Adam about it, he refused to discuss it. Oh, dear God, help us. What has he got himself mixed up in? Something seemed to give way in her, and she sagged towards me, her arms outstretched. For a moment I thought she might have fainted, but then I realized she was clinging to me, holding on so fiercely that I could feel her bitten fingernails through the thick material of the robe. I'm afraid, she said in a muffled voice. I've never been frightened in my life before, but I am now. Your hair's wet, I said gently. You're drenched. Let me get you a towel. I extricated myself and went into the bathroom. When I returned, she'd taken off her robe and had got into bed, pulling up the sheet to cover her breasts. Do you mind? She said. Of course not. I turned off the light and climbed in beside her. She rolled over and put her hand on my chest and pressed her lips very hard against mine, as if she were trying to give me the kiss of life. And considered how I was going to reach Edgartown. That was when the idea of borrowing the tan-coloured Ford which Makara had driven popped into my head. I don't actually own a car. I've never found much need living alone in London, and on the rare occasions I hire one, it always seems that another layer of gadgets has been added, so that the instrument panel of the average family saloon now looks to me like the cockpit of a jumbo. There was a mystifying screen to the right of the wheel which came alive when I switched on the engine. Pulsing green arcs were shown radiating upwards from the Earth to an orbiting space station. As I watched, the pulse switched direction, and the arcs beamed down from the heavens. An instant later, the screen showed a large red arrow, a yellow path, and a great patch of blue. An American woman's voice, soft but commanding, said from somewhere behind me, "Join the road as soon as possible." I would have turned her off, but I couldn't see how, so I quickly put the Ford into reverse and backed out of the garage. "In 200 yards, instructed the voice. "Turn left." "I'm sorry," I muttered, and took a right towards Edgartown. "Turn around where possible." "Oh, this is getting ridiculous," I said out loud and pulled over. I pressed various buttons on the navigator's console with the aim of shutting it down. The screen changed and offered me a menu. I can't remember all the options. One was enter a new destination. I think another was return to home address, and a third, the one highlighted, was remember previous destination. I stared at it for a while, as the potential implications slowly filtered into my brain. I couldn't be sure that Makara had been the last person to enter an address, but if he had been, I had to face the fact that he hadn't returned from the trip alive. Cautiously, I pressed select. "In 200 yards, turn right. In 50 yards, turn right. Turn right." I steered down the hill into Vineyard Haven, passing a school bus toiling up it. I had a brief impression of a deserted shopping street away to my left, and then I was into the flat, shabby area around the port. About 100 yards away, across the puddled, rain-swept tarmac, a queue of vehicles was driving up the ramp of a ferry. The red arrow pointed me towards it. I emerged into the grey rain and wind of Woods Hole an hour or so later. "In 200 yards, at the roundabout, take the second exit." I took it, and for the next 45 minutes I headed north on a couple of big freeways, more or less retracing my route back to Boston. Just as I was beginning to think that perhaps Makara had been making a run for the Canadian border, the voice behind me told me to take the next exit from the interstate, and I moved into the right-hand lane and came down the slip road. A sign pointed to Belmont, and that was more or less the way I went, along roads which gradually became less populated as the price of the real estate rose. I turned right into some woods, and then, in the middle of nowhere, my guardian angel announced, in a tone of calm finality,
"You have reached your destination."
I pulled up onto the verge and turned off the engine. I got out of the car and locked it. After 2 hours driving, I needed to fill my lungs with cold, New England air. I stretched and started to walk down the wet lane. I walked for about 50 yards, until I came to an almost invisible gap in the trees. Demurely set back from the road, a 5-barred electric gate blocked access to a private drive, which turned sharply after a few yards and disappeared behind trees. I noticed that the mailbox was crammed too full to close properly, and I saw no harm in at least discovering the name of the house's owner. I pulled out a handful of mail. It was addressed to Professor and Mrs. Paul Emmett. I stuffed the letters back in the box and returned to my car. I opened my suitcase, took out the package addressed to Macara, and 10 minutes later, I'd found what I had vaguely remembered. P. Emmett, St. John's, was one of the cast of the Footlights Review, pictured with Lang. I stuffed the photographs and the page from the memoirs into my shoulder bag. Then I turned on the engine and drove up to the gate. This time, when I pressed the buzzer, the answer came immediately. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice. "I wondered if I could have a word with Professor Emmett."
"Do you have an appointment?"
It's about Adam Lang. I'm assisting him with his memoirs."
"Just a moment, please."
There was the whir of an electric motor, and the gate slowly opened.
"You must forgive me if I seem a little groggy," said Emmett, after we'd shaken hands. "We just flew in from Washington. I'm feeling somewhat tired."
I took out the cast photograph and gave it to him. He pushed his glasses up onto his silvery thatch of hair and wandered over with it to the hall window.
"Well, well," he
said, holding the monochrome image up to the weak winter light, tilting it this way and that.
"I have literally no recollection of this."
He opened the door to his study, and I followed him in. One wall was devoted to memorabilia, citations, degrees, photographs of Emmett with Bill Clinton and Al Gore, Emmett with Margaret Thatcher and Nelson Mandela, Emmett with Lang, a grin and grip at what appeared to be a cocktail party. He saw me looking at it.
"The wall of ego," he said. "We all have them. Poor Lang, it's a very bad business, this posturing by the Hague. As for Reichardt, the worst foreign secretary since the war, in my view, it was a terrible error to appoint him. But if the ICC continues to behave so foolishly, they will succeed merely in making Lang first a martyr, and then a hero, and thus," he added, gesturing graciously towards me, "a bestseller."
"How well do you know him?"
"Lang, hardly at all." "You look surprised."
"He mentions you in his memoirs."
"Well, that's decent of him," said Emmett, "but that doesn't mean I know him."
"And then there's that," I said, pointing to the wall of ego.
"Oh, that?"
Emmett waved his hand dismissively.
"That was taken at a reception at Claridge's to mark the 10th anniversary of the Arcadia Institution."
"The Arcadia Institution," I repeated.
"It's a little organization I used to run. It's very select. No reason why you should have heard of it. The Prime Minister graced us with his presence. It was purely professional. Now," he said, twirling in his chair and lifting his feet off his desk, he was suddenly much more businesslike, "you were going to tell me where you got those pictures."
"Well, does the name Michael Macara mean anything to you?"
"Nope, should it?"
He answered just a touch too quickly, I thought. "Macara was my predecessor on the Lang memoirs," I said. "He was the one who ordered the pictures from England. He drove up here to see you nearly 3 weeks ago and died a few hours afterwards."
"Drove up to see me?"
Emmett shook his head.
"I'm afraid you're mistaken. How did he die?"
"He drowned."
"I'm very sorry to hear it."
"The police never said anything to you about this?"
"No, I've had no contact with the police whatsoever."
"Were you here that weekend? This would have been January the 11th and 12th. Emmett sighed.
"A less equable man than I would start to find your questions impertinent."
He came out from behind his desk and went over to the door.
"Nancy," he called. "Our visitor wishes to know where we were on the weekend of the 11th and 12th. "Oh, that was the Colorado weekend," called his wife. "We were in Aspen."
"Were you there all weekend?"
"I was. said Mrs. Emmett. "I stayed for the skiing, but Emmett came back on Sunday."
"So you could have seen Macara," I said.
"I could have, but I didn't. Now, I've said all I have to say on that matter. Nancy, show our friend out, would you? Be sure to make a right at the bottom of the drive. If you turn left, the road will take you deeper into the woods, and you'll never be seen again."
It's curious how the processes of fear work. If I'd been asked a week earlier to predict what I might do in such a situation, I'd have said that I'd drive straight back to Martha's Vineyard and try to put the whole business out of my mind. In fact, I discovered my instinct at that moment was somehow to get back at the supercilious Emmett. So instead of sensibly trying to find my way back to the interstate, I followed the road signs to Belmont and found my way to an internet cafe. I ordered a coffee and a bagel, clicked on a search engine, typed in Paul Emmett, Arcadia Institution, and leaned towards the screen. I worked my way through the first of 37,000 entries about Emmett and Arcadia, and when I got bored with the same old stuff about seminars and summer conferences, I changed my search request to Arcadia Institution Adam Lang, and got a news story about Arcadia's anniversary reception and the Prime Minister's attendance. I returned to the Arcadia Institution website and clicked on the Board of Trustees. Up they all came, like spirits summoned from the vast transatlantic deep. Laboriously, I began entering their names, together with Adam Lang's, into the search engine. I was starting to weary of the whole procedure until I typed in Arthur Prussia. And then I got a 1-year-old press release. London. The Hallington Group is pleased to announce that Adam Lang, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, will be joining the company as strategic consultant. Mr. Lang's position, which will not be full-time, will involve providing counsel and advice to senior Hallington investment professionals worldwide. I'd never heard of the Hallington Group, so I looked it up. The portfolio of companies it controlled looked as if it had been drawn up by Darth Vader. Hallington's subsidiaries manufactured cluster bombs, mobile howitzers, interceptor missiles, tank-busting helicopters, swing-wing bombers, tanks, nuclear centrifuges, aircraft carriers. 2 members of its main board had been senior directors of the CIA. I sat back in my chair, and then I typed a fresh request into the search engine. Paul Emmett, CIA. Immediately, the screen filled with results. I clicked on one and came to a hyperlinked list of about 20 names, among them Emmett's, and when I clicked on it, I felt as though I'd fallen through a trapdoor. Yale graduate Paul Emmett was reported by CIA whistleblower Frank Molinari to have joined the agency as an officer in either 1969 or 1970, where he was assigned to the Foreign Resources Division of the Directorate of Operations. Source, inside the agency, Amsterdam, 1977. "Oh, no," I said quietly. No, that can't be right." Fairly calmly, more calmly, I hoped, than I felt, I turned off the computer. I took out the photographs again and flicked through them until I came to the one of Lang and Emmett on stage together. A future Prime Minister and an alleged CIA officer, prancing around wearing gloves and hats in a comic review. It seemed not so much improbable as grotesque. But here was the evidence in my hand. I turned the picture over and considered the number scrawled on the back, and the more I considered it, the more obvious it seemed that there was only one course of action open to me. I scrolled down to where the number was stored and called Richard Reichart. This time he answered within a few seconds. "So you rang back?" he said quietly in that nasal, sing-song voice of his. "Somehow I had a feeling you would, whoever you are. Not many people have this number." I took the plunge. "I'm working for Adam Lang. Don't tell me your name," he said quickly. "Don't use any names. Can you get to the city where I am right away? You know where I am, I take it, where I work." "I suppose so," I said doubtfully. "I have a car I could drive." "No," he said, "don't drive. Flying's safer than the roads. That's what the airlines say." "Listen, my friend. If I was in your position, I wouldn't joke. Go to the nearest airport. Catch the first available plane. Text me the flight number, nothing else. I'll arrange for someone to collect you when you land." I started to raise an objection, but it was too late. He had hung up. I was heading out of the gate into the arrivals hall. Reichardt had implied I'd recognize his man when I saw him, and I did, and my heart almost stopped. He was standing apart from the others, and he was holding a small blackboard on which was chalked, "Mike Macara." I followed him out into the pandemonium of the New York night. "If you need to make contact, use this," he said, giving me a brand new cell phone, still in its polythene wrapper. "There's a chip inside with $20 worth of calls on it. Don't choose your old phone. The safest thing is to turn it off. You pay for your room in advance with cash. This is the card you use to guarantee the extras. The name on the card is the name you register under." He let me out in front of a big glass-fronted hotel and conference center overlooking Grand Central Parkway. Once I was through the revolving door and inside the lobby, I checked the name on the card. "I have a reservation," I said to the clerk at the desk, "in the name of Dixon." I took the elevator to the 6th floor, stuck the electronic keycard into the door, and walked straight to the minibar. I didn't even bother to find a glass. I unscrewed the cap and drank straight from the miniature bottle. About 20 minutes later, my new telephone suddenly glowed blue and began to emit a faintly ominous electronic purr. I answered it. "It's me," said Reichardt. "Are you alone?" "Yes." "Open the door, then." He was standing in the corridor, his phone to his ear. Beside him was the driver who had met me at LaGuardia. "All right, Frank," said Reichardt to his minder. "I'll take it from here. You keep an eye out in the lobby." He came into the room without waiting for an invitation, went straight over to the window and drew the curtains. "So," he said, sitting down on the bed, "how do we begin? You know who I am. Who are you?" "I'm a ghostwriter," I said. "I was brought in to rewrite Adam Lang's memoirs after Mike Macara died." "You mentioned a photograph," he said. "Can I see it?" When I fetched the envelope, his face had the same greedy expression as Emmett's, but when he saw the picture, he couldn't hide his disappointment. "Is this it?" he said. "Just a bunch of privileged kids doing a song and dance act." It's a bit more interesting than that," I said. "For a start, why's your number on the back of it?" He got to his feet and patrolled up and down in front of the bed. "This ICC business has only hit the headlines in the past week," said Reichardt. "But let me tell you, I've been pursuing it behind the scenes for years. Iraq, rendition, torture, Guantanamo, what's been done in this so-called war on terror is illegal under international law, just as much as anything that's happened in Kosovo or Liberia. The only difference is we're the ones doing it. The hypocrisy is nauseating." He seemed to realize he was starting on a speech he'd already made too many times before and checked himself. "Anyway, rhetoric is one thing, and evidence is another thing entirely. I could sense the political climate changing. Every time a bomb went off, every time another soldier was killed, every time it became a little bit clearer we'd started another 100 years' war without a clue how to end it. Things shifted further my way. It was no longer inconceivable that a Western leader could wind up in the dock. What I needed was just one piece of evidence that would meet the legal standard of proof, and I didn't have it. And then, suddenly, just before Christmas, there it was. It just came through the post. Top secret memorandum from the Prime Minister to the Secretary of State for Defence, a directive from the British Prime Minister that these 4 poor bastards should be snatched off the streets in Pakistan by the SAS and handed over to the CIA. "A war crime," I said. "A war crime," he agreed. "A minor one, okay, but so what? In the end, they could only get Al Capone for tax evasion. It didn't mean he wasn't a gangster." "You'd no idea who it came from?" "No. Not until my anonymous source called and told me.
And just you wait till Lang hears who it was. He leaned in close to me. Mike Macara. He called about 3 weeks after I first got the document. I almost had a heart attack. Then I had to shut him up quickly because, of course, you know that the phone lines at the UN are all bugged.
Are they? I was still trying to absorb everything.
Oh, completely. So I told Mike to stop right there. Then I gave him a brand new number I'd never used before and asked him to call me straight back.
We must have scribbled the number on the back of the photograph he was holding at the time. What did he say?
He said he'd just spent the past year in the archives in Cambridge working on Adam's memoirs, going over our whole time in government and just getting more and more disillusioned with it all. He said that was where he'd found the memorandum about Operation Tempest. But the real reason he was calling, he said, was that was just the tip of the iceberg. He'd just discovered something much more important, something that made sense of everything that had gone wrong while we were in power.
I could hardly breathe. What was it?
He wouldn't tell me over the phone. The only thing he would say was that the key to it could be found in Lang's autobiography, if anyone bothered to check, that it was all there in the beginning. And then about a week later, he was dead. Nobody else ever called me on that phone because nobody else had that number. So you can imagine why I was so excited when it suddenly started ringing again. And so here we are, he said, gesturing to the room. And I think you should tell me exactly what the hell is going on.
I don't know, I said. All I know is that he'd just found out that one of the men in the picture with Lang at Cambridge was an officer in the CIA. His name is Paul Emmett. Suddenly, I couldn't get the words out fast enough. I was desperate to unburden myself, to let someone else try to make sense of it. He later became a professor at Harvard. Then he went on to run something called the Arcadia Institution. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it. Of course I've heard of it. And I've always steered well clear of it, precisely because I've always thought it had CIA written all over it.
Reichardt sat down. He seemed stunned. After that, I told him everything I'd discovered. And the more I talked, the more excited Reichardt became.
Just suppose, he said, pacing up and down again, that it was Emmett who originally suggested to Lang that he should think about a career in politics. What year did Lang join?
1975.
That would make perfect sense. Do you remember what Britain was like in 75? It wouldn't exactly be a surprise if the CIA had decided to recruit a few bright young things and had encouraged them to make their careers in useful places, the civil service, the media, politics. It's what they do everywhere else, after all.
But not in Britain, surely, I said. We're an ally. Reichardt looked at me with contempt.
The CIA was spying on American students back then. Do you really think they'd have been squeamish about spying on ours? Of course they were active in Britain. They still are. They have a head of station in London and a huge staff. I could name you half a dozen MPs right now who are in regular contact with the CIA. In fact,
he stopped pacing and clicked his fingers.
Does the name Reg Giffen mean anything to you?
Vaguely.
Spent so long making speeches in the House of Commons on behalf of the Americans. We used to call him the member for Michigan. He announced his resignation as an MP in the first week of the 1983 general election campaign, and it caught everyone by surprise, apart from one very enterprising and photogenic young party member who just happened to have moved into his constituency 6 months earlier.
And who then got the nomination to become the party's candidate with Giffen's support, I said, and who won one of the safest seats in the country when he was still only 30. The story was legendary. It was the start of Lang's rise to national prominence. But you can't really think that the CIA asked Giffen to help fix it so that Lang could get into Parliament. That sounds very far-fetched. Reichardt sat down again. He leaned towards me.
Okay, here's a quiz for you. Name me one decision that Adam Lang took as Prime Minister that wasn't in the interests of the United States of America.
I was silent. Reichardt laughed ruefully and shook his head.
You know, in a way, I'm almost relieved to discover there might be a rational explanation. If you think about it, the alternative's actually worse. At least if he was working for the CIA, it makes sense. So now, he said, patting my knee, the question is, what are we going to do about it? I didn't like the sound of that first-person plural. There isn't actually any proof, I pointed out, and short of Lang confessing or the CIA opening their files, there never will be. Then you'll just have to get some, said Reichardt flatly. What? You're in the perfect position, he went on. He trusts you. He lets you ask him whatever you like. He even allows you to tape his answers. The tapes can be subpoenaed by the War Crimes Court as evidence of his direct complicity with the CIA rendition program. What if I don't make any tapes? In that case, I'll suggest to the prosecutor that she subpoenas you. And what if I deny the whole story? Then I'll give her this, said Reichardt, and opened his jacket to show a small microphone clipped to the front of his shirt with a wire trailing into his inside pocket. After a few seconds I started to swear, fluently and indiscriminately. I was swearing at Reichardt and at my own stupidity, at the war crimes prosecutor, at the court, the judges. And I would have gone on for a lot longer if my telephone hadn't started to ring. Don't answer it, warned Reichardt. It'll lead them straight to us. I looked at the incoming number. It's Amelia Bly, I said. I pressed the green button. Hi, I said. Amelia. Good evening, she said. I have Adam for you. I mouthed, it's Adam Lang, at Reichardt, and an instant later the familiar classless voice filled my ear. Ruth tells me you're in New York. That's right. So am I. Whereabouts are you? I made a helpless gesture at Reichardt. I haven't checked in anywhere yet. We're at the Waldorf, said Lang. Why don't you come over? Hold on a second, Adam. I pressed mute. Reichardt sucked in his cheeks, appraising the options. You should go, he said. And what if it's a trap? It's a risk, but it'll look odd if you don't go. Tell him yes, quickly, and then hang up. I pressed mute again. Hi, Adam, I said, trying to keep the tension out of my voice. That's great. I'll be right over. The elevator down to the lobby stopped at every floor. Reichardt grew more and more nervous. We mustn't be seen together, he muttered, as we stepped out of the ground floor. You hang back, we'll meet you in the car park. I bent and pretended to tie my shoelace, then took my time crossing the lobby. There was something now so ludicrous about this whole situation that, as I joined the crush at the door waiting to get out, I actually found myself smiling. And that was when I saw Emmett. And suddenly I wasn't smiling anymore. The hotel had one of these big revolving doors with compartments that hold 5 or 6 people at a time, all of whom are obliged to lunge into it and shuffle forwards to avoid knocking into one another, like convicts on a chain gang. Luckily for me, I was in the middle of the outgoing group, which is probably why Emmett didn't see me. We came out into the night and I stumbled, almost falling over in my anxiety to get away. Across the parking lot, a pair of headlights came on and then drove straight at me. The car swerved at the last moment, and the rear passenger door flew open. I just saw Emmett, I said. Reichardt exchanged looks in the mirror with his driver. We sped down the slip road and pulled into the heavy traffic heading towards Manhattan. I felt sick, and despite the freezing night, I lowered the window. The wind was blowing from the east, gusting off the river, carrying on its cold industrial edge the sickly tang of aviation fuel. I can still taste it at the back of my throat whenever I think of it, and that, for me, will always be the taste of fear. And beside it, flanking the Waldorf's entrance, a Union Jack. The area in front of the hotel was cordoned off by concrete blocks. Frank pulled up briefly on the corner of East 50th Street to let me out, then eased deftly back into the traffic. I crossed the great expanse of road and went through the Art Deco doors, up the grand marble staircase, and into the Babylonian splendor of the Waldorf's lobby. A loud detonation sounded in Park Avenue. Several guests who were checking in ducked, only to straighten ruefully when the explosion turned into a cannonade of gunning motorcycle engines. From the interior of the hotel,
Across the immense expanse of the golden lobby came a wedge of security men, special branch and Secret Service, with Lang enclosed among them. Behind him walked Amelia and the two secretaries. Lang swept by me, his eyes fixed straight ahead, which was unlike him. Usually he liked to connect with people when he passed them, flash them a smile they'd remember always. As he began descending the staircase, Amelia saw me. "I was just trying to call you," she said as she went by. She didn't break step. "There's been a change of plan. We're flying back to Martha's Vineyard now." Lang, below and ahead of us, had already reached the grand entrance. The bodyguards opened the doors, and we emerged into the tumult of noise and light, the shouts of reporters, the fusillade of camera shutters, the rumble of Harley-Davidsons. It was as if someone had rolled back the doors to hell. "And what am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Get into the backup car. I expect Adam will want to talk to you on the plane." In different circumstances, I would have relished that journey, my legs stretched out before me, the Harley-Davidsons gliding past us to hold back the traffic, the pale faces of the pedestrians glimpsed through the smoked glass, turning to watch us as we hurtled by. When we reached La Guardia, a few minutes later, we drove past the terminal building, through an open metal gate and directly onto the tarmac, where a big private jet was being fueled. Lang's limousine swerved to a halt, and he dived through the doorway of the mobile body scanner and up the steps into the Gulf Stream without a backward glance. "He says he has to get back to Ruth," said Amelia, gazing up at the plane. "There's something he needs to talk over with her." Her voice was puzzled. She was almost talking to herself, as if I wasn't there. "Perhaps he's heard something from The Hague," I suggested. "No, it's nothing to do with that. He would have told me." I sat with my back to the cockpit so that I could keep an eye on my client. Amelia was directly opposite him, and as the engines started to whine, it was all I could do not to hurl myself at the door and wrench it open. That flight felt doomed to me from the start. The noise of the engines increased, and we began our charge down the runway. It felt as though we were climbing blindly for a long time in our vulnerable metal tube, but then the gauze fell away and we came up into a bright night. Some time after the plane levelled off, Amelia rose and came down the aisle towards me. "All right," she said, "he's ready to have a word, but go easy on him, okay? He's had a hell of a couple of days." He and I both, I thought. "Will do," I said. "You haven't got long," she warned. "This flight's only a hop." His eyes were closed, a glass held in his outstretched hand. He had removed his jacket and tie, and eased off his shoes, and was sprawled back in his seat like a starfish. At first I thought he'd fallen asleep, but then I realized his eyes were narrowed to slits, and he was watching me closely. I sat down and fumbled to pull out my notebook, the mini recorder and a spare tape. Wasn't this what Reichardt wanted? Tapes. "So," he said, "how's it going? Found out anything interesting?" There was a gleam of something in his eyes. Contempt? Amusement? I sensed he was playing with me. This and that. "How was Washington?" "Washington was great, actually." There's a rustling noise as he straightened slightly in his chair, drawing himself up to give one last performance before the theatre closes for the night. "I got the most terrific support everywhere, on the Hill, of course, as you probably saw, but also the Vice President and the Secretary of State. They're going to help me in every way they can." "And is the bottom line that you'll be able to settle in America?" "Oh, yes. If the worst comes to the worst, they'll offer me asylum, but it won't get that far. They're going to supply something much more valuable." "Really?" Lang nodded. "Evidence. Is that thing working?" he asked. There is a deafening clunk as I pick up the tape recorder. "Yes, I think so. Is that okay?" "I just want to make sure you get this down," said Lang. He leaned forwards to emphasize his words. "Washington is prepared to provide sworn testimony that no United Kingdom personnel were directly involved in the capture of those 4 men in Pakistan." "Really?" "You bet. The director of the CIA himself will provide a deposition to the court in The Hague, saying that this was an entirely American operation, and if that doesn't do the trick, he's prepared to let the actual officers who were running the mission provide evidence in camera." Lang sat back and sipped his brandy. "That should give Reichardt something to think about." How's he going to make a charge of war crimes stick now? But your memorandum to the Ministry of Defence, that's genuine? He conceded with a shrug. It's true. I can't deny that I urged the use of the SAS, and it's true that our special forces were in Peshawar at the time of Operation Tempest, but there's no proof that we passed that intelligence on to the CIA. The men arrested in Peshawar claim they were innocent, I pointed out. Well, of course they claim they were innocent. What else are they going to say? Lang studied me closely, as if seeing me for the first time. I'm beginning to think you're too naive for this job. Unlike Mike Macara, I said. Mike? Lang laughed and shook his head. Mike was naive in a different way. Is it true you had a serious row with him just before he died? Mike made certain wild accusations. I could hardly ignore them. May I ask what kind of accusations? I could imagine Reichardt and the special prosecutor sitting listening to the tape, straightening in their chairs at that. On the tape, the pause that follows is quite short, but at the time it seemed endless, and Lang's voice, when it came, was deadly quiet. I'd prefer not to repeat them. Were they to do with the CIA? Surely you already know, said Lang bitterly, if you've been to see Paul Emmett. At this time the pause is as long on the recording as it is in my memory. Delivered of his bombshell, Lang gazed out of the window and sipped his drink. I looked at him, and saw that the years had caught up with him at last. I doubt he could have had much sleep for weeks, probably not since Macara had confronted him. When at last he turned back to me, there wasn't anger in his expression, merely a great weariness. I want you to understand, he said, with heavy emphasis, that everything I did, both as party leader and as Prime Minister, I did out of conviction because I believed it was right. I mumbled a reply. Emmett claims you showed him some photographs. May I see? I removed them from the envelope and pushed them across the table towards him. Odd, murmured Lang. Way we've all changed so much, and yet also stayed exactly the same. He squinted closely at one of the riverbank pictures. It was the girls, I noticed, rather than himself or Emmett, who seemed to fascinate him the most. I remember her, he said, tapping the picture, and her. She wrote to me once when I was Prime Minister. Ruth was not pleased. Oh, God, he said, and passed his hand across his face. Ruth. For a moment, I thought he was about to break down. But when he looked at me, his eyes were dry. What happens next? Is there a procedure in your line of work to deal with this sort of situation? Well, the client always has the last word about what goes in a book, I said. Always. But obviously, in this case, given what happened. On the tape, my voice trails away, and then there is a loud clunk, as Lang leaned forward and grabbed my forearm. If you mean what happened to Mike, then let me tell you, I was absolutely appalled by that. His gaze was fixed on me unwaveringly. He was putting everything he had left into the task of convincing me, and I'll freely confess, despite everything I'd discovered, that he succeeded. To this day, I'm sure he was telling the truth. If you believe nothing else, you must please believe that his death had nothing to do with me, and I shall carry that image of Mike in the morgue until my own dying day. We were coming in low over the treetops. The lights of the Gulf Stream gleamed across dark waves of foliage. I tried to pull my arm away. Excuse me, I said. Lang reluctantly let go of me, and I fastened my seatbelt. My God. You've already told someone, haven't you? I could feel myself turning scarlet. Who have you told? Looking out at the dark forest beyond the perimeter of the airport, where anything could be lurking, it seemed like the only insurance policy I had. Richard Reichardt, I said. Lang must have known then that it was the end of everything. In my mind's eye, I see him still, like one of those once grand but now condemned apartment blocks, moments after the demolition charges have been exploded, For a few seconds, the facade remains bizarrely intact, before slowly beginning to slide. At the front of the plane, the door had opened, and 3 of the Special Branch men were disembarking. The pilot had come out of the cockpit to say goodbye, and I saw Lang visibly square his shoulders and advance to meet him, his hand outstretched. "That was great," said Lang vaguely. "As usual. My favorite airline." He shook the pilot's hand, then leaned past him to greet the co-pilot and the waiting steward. Thanks so much." He turned to us, still smiling his professional smile, but it faded fast. He looked stricken. The bodyguard was already halfway down the steps. There was just Amelia, me, and the 2 secretaries waiting to follow him off the plane. Standing in the lighted glass window of the terminal, I could just make out the figure of Ruth. "Would you mind just hanging back a minute?" he said to Amelia. "And you too," he added to me. "I need to have a private word with my wife." "Is everything all right, Adam?" asked Amelia. "It'll be fine," said Lang. He touched her elbow lightly, then gave us all, including me and the plane crew, a slight bow. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good night." He ducked through the door and paused at the top of the steps. Amelia and I watched him from the interior of the plane. He was just as he was when I first saw him, searching for an audience with whom he could connect. Even though the windy, floodlit concourse was deserted, apart from the waiting bodyguards, and a ground technician in overalls working late, no doubt eager to get home. Lang must have seen Ruth waiting at the window because he suddenly raised his hand in acknowledgement, then set off down the steps gracefully, like a dancer. He'd gone about 10 yards towards the terminal when the technician shouted out, "Adam!" and waved. The voice was English, and Lang must have recognized the accent of a fellow countryman because he suddenly broke away from his bodyguards and strode towards him, his hand held out. And that's my final image of him. A man always with his hand held out. It is burned onto my retina, his yearning shadow against the expanding ball of bright white fire that suddenly engulfed him. And then there was only the flying debris, the stinging grit, I just lay across the aisle in darkness and silence until eventually I was lifted away, given a wonderful shot of morphine that burst like warm fireworks in my brain, and airlifted by helicopter to hospital. Over the next few days I was questioned by a Special Agent Murphy from the Boston office of the FBI about what I could remember. Then when the bandages were removed from my eyes, he returned and showed me a photograph. My vision was bleary, but I was nevertheless able to identify the crazy man who had staged that lonely vigil with the biblical slogan at the end of the track from the Reinhardt compound. His name, they said, was George Arthur Boxer, a former major in the British Army, whose son had been killed in Iraq and whose wife had died 6 months later in a London suicide bombing. In his unhinged state, Major Boxer had held Adam Lang personally responsible and had stalked him to Martha's Vineyard. There was a limit to what security could do, said the man from MI5, against a determined suicide bomber. A few days later, Rick came up from New York to say goodbye and take me to the airport. "Do you want the good news or the good news?" he said. "Sid Kroll just called. Ruth Lang still wants you to finish the memoirs, and Maddox will give you an extra month to work on the manuscript." "And the good news is?" "Oh, very cute. Listen, don't be so goddamn snooty about it. The whole situation is rich with possibilities. You can write what you like within reason. Nobody's going to stop you. And you liked him, didn't you?" I thought about that. In fact, I'd been thinking about it ever since I came round from the sedative. Worse than the pain in my eyes and the buzzing in my ears, worse even than my fear that I would never emerge from the hospital, was my sense of guilt. If I hadn't gone to see Emmett, Emmett wouldn't have contacted Lang to warn him about the photograph. Then maybe Lang wouldn't have insisted on flying back to Martha's Vineyard that night to see Ruth. Then I wouldn't have had to tell him about Reichardt. And then... It nagged away at me as I lay in the darkness. I couldn't erase the memory of how bleak he had looked on the plain at the very end. Yes, I said to Rick. Yes, I did like him. And so I returned to London. And for the next 6 weeks I barely emerged from my flat. I started writing Memoirs by Adam Lang on February the 10th, and promised Maddox I'd have the whole thing done by the end of March. It was a hard slog, especially as almost no lines of Makara's were salvageable, except, curiously, the very last one in the manuscript, which had made me groan aloud when I read it on Martha's Vineyard. Ruth and I look forward to the future, whatever it may hold. Read that, you bastards, I thought, as I typed it in on that evening of the 30th of March. Read that and close this book without a catch in your throat. I added, the end, and then, I guess, I had a kind of nervous breakdown. I could barely summon the energy to get out of bed before noon, and when I did, I moped on the sofa in my dressing gown, watching daytime television. One morning about 2 months after I'd finished the book, I left the flat early and walked down the hill to the tube station. I boarded the train, travelled to the end of the line at Hammersmith, then crossed the road to the other platform. Motion was the cure for depression, I decided. At Embankment, I changed again for Morden. We passed through Balham, and I got off 2 stops later. I had remembered Ruth saying that Makara's funeral was at Streatham Cemetery. It didn't take long to find his grave. I looked up his name, and a groundsman pointed the way to the plot, where I noticed, resting against the stone, a small bunch of shriveled flowers. There was a card attached, written in an elegant hand, just legible after successive London downpours. In memory of a good friend and loyal colleague, rest in peace, dear Mike, Amelia. When I got back to my flat, I called her. I was just thinking about you, she said. I'm reading your book. Adam's book. And? It's good. No, actually, it's better than good. It's like having him back. There's only one element missing, I think. And what's that? Oh, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you if I see you. Perhaps we'll get the opportunity to talk at the reception tonight. What reception? She laughed. Your reception, you idiot. The launch of your book. Oh, you must have been invited. Listen, I'll meet you at the end of Downing Street at 7 o'clock. The party's just across Whitehall. I'll only wait 5 minutes, so if you decide to come, don't be late. I knew it was a mistake the moment we stepped inside. I'd made it a rule never to attend the launch parties of my own books, and now I remembered why. Deftly I seized a couple of flutes of champagne from a passing waiter and presented one to Amelia. We clinked glasses. It's Ruth, actually, who's the missing element from your book, if I had to make a criticism. I know, I said. I'd wanted to put in more about her, but she wouldn't have it. Well, it's a pity. Drink seemed to embolden the normally cautious Mrs. Bligh, for she leaned in close to me, giving me a familiar lungful of her scent. I adored Adam, but I wasn't under any illusions. He'd never have left her. He knew perfectly well he'd have been nothing without her. She was the one who really understood power. In fact, she was the one who was supposed to go into Parliament. That isn't in your book. I didn't know. Adam told me about it once. Apparently, his seat was originally all lined up for her. Only at the last minute she stood aside and let him have it. I thought of my conversation with Reichardt, the member for Michigan, I murmured. Can I ask you a question? I said. Before Adam was killed, why were you so determined to keep that manuscript under lock and key? Amelia glanced around. Between you and me, she said quietly, we weren't the ones who were concerned. Apparently it was the Americans. I was told they'd passed the word to MI5 that there might be something early on in the manuscript that was a potential threat to national security. I thought again of my meeting with Reichardt. The key to everything is in Lang's autobiography. It's all there in the beginning. The roar of talk was dwindling. At the side of the room, opposite the big windows, Ruth Lang was waiting patiently on a platform, holding a microphone. Thank you, she said. Thank you very much. And good evening. She paused, and a great stillness spread across 300 people. She took a breath. There was a catch in her throat.
"I miss Adam all the time, but never more than tonight. Not just because we're meeting to launch his wonderful book, and he should be here to share the joy of his life story with us, but because he was so brilliant at making speeches and I'm so terrible. Therefore," she continued, "I'd just like to propose a toast to the memory of a great man and a great patriot, a great father and a wonderful husband. To Adam Lang."
"To Adam Lang," we all boomed in unison, while Ruth nodded graciously to all corners of the hall.
"Death becomes her, don't you think? She's blossoming by the day."
"I have a feeling she's coming over," I said. Even as Amelia moved away to talk to someone else, the crowd parted, and Ruth emerged.
"I was told you couldn't stand these kinds of parties," she said, fixing me with her glittering dark eyes, "or else I would have invited you." As she spoke, she did that thing that important people always do to me at parties. She glanced over my shoulder, and I saw almost immediately, and quite unmistakably in her gaze, a flash of alarm, which was followed at once by a barely perceptible shake of her head. I detached my hands and turned around and saw Paul Emmett. "Hello," he said. "I believe we've met." I swung back to Ruth. I tried to speak, but no words would come. "Paul was my tutor," she said calmly, "when I was a Fulbright scholar at Harvard." Ruth was saying something earnestly, but there was a buzzing in my ears and I couldn't hear her. I saw Amelia staring at me, and I waved my hands feebly, and then I fled from the hall, across the lobby, and out into the hollow imperial grandeur of Whitehall. The key to everything is in Lang's autobiography. It's all there in the beginning. When I reached my flat, I grabbed my copy of the finished book, took it over to my desk, and started flicking through the opening chapters. I swept my eyes over all the made-up feelings and half-true memories. My professional prose, typeset and bound, had rendered the roughness of a human life as smooth as a plastered wall. What a worthless piece of junk it was. I was glad Lang wasn't around to read it. I opened a drawer and grabbed Makara's original manuscript. Chapter 1. Langs are Scottish folk originally and proud of it. I remembered the deathless beginning I had cut so ruthlessly on Martha's Vineyard. But then, come to think of it, every single one of Makara's chapter beginnings had been particularly dreadful. Chapter 2, Wife and Child in Tow. Chapter 3, Ruth saw the possibility that I might become party leader. Chapter 4, Studying the failures of my predecessors. And all the way down to Chapter 16, Professor Paul Emmett of Harvard University. Beginning or beginnings? I was never any good at puzzles. But when I went through the pages and circled the first word of each chapter, even I couldn't help but see it. The sentence that Makara, fearful for his safety, had embedded in the manuscript like a message from the grave. Lang's wife, Ruth, studying in 76, was recruited as a CIA agent in America by Professor Paul Emmett of Harvard University. I left my flat that night, never to return. Since then, a month has passed. As far as I know, I haven't been missed. There were times, especially in the first week, sitting alone in my scruffy hotel room when I was sure I'd gone mad. But then about 3 weeks ago, I heard on the midnight news that the former Foreign Secretary, Richard Reichart, had been killed in a car accident in New York City, along with his driver. I knew after that there was no going back. Most days, I've listened to the tape of my final conversation with Lang. Emmett claims you showed him some photographs. And then nothing for a while, but engine sound. And I spool forwards to the part where he lingers over the girls at the picnic on the riverbank. He sounds inexpressibly sad. I remember her. And her. She wrote to me once, when I was Prime Minister. Ruth was not pleased. Oh, God. Ruth. It's obvious from his voice that at that moment, when he remembers his wife, his concern is entirely for her.
She must have called him late that afternoon in a panic to report I'd been to see Emmett. She would have needed to talk to him face to face as soon as possible. The whole story was threatening to unravel, but it's Lang's failure to complete the sentence that I find moving. "What have you done?" is surely what he means to add. Oh God, Ruth, what have you done? This, I think, is the instant when he realizes that Makara's wild accusations must have been true after all, and his wife of 30 years is not the woman he thought she was. I would like to write more, but I fear that this will have to do. I don't care to linger in any one place too long, and already I sense that strangers are starting to take too close an interest in me. My plan is to parcel up a copy of this manuscript and give it to Kate, with a letter asking her to look after it. Only if she doesn't hear from me within a month, or if she discovers something has happened to me, is she to read it and decide how best to get it published. This puts me in something of a dilemma now that we reach the final paragraph. Am I supposed to be pleased that you are reading this, or not? Pleased, of course, to speak at last in my own voice. Disappointed, obviously, that it probably means I'm dead. But then, as my mother used to say, I'm afraid in this life you just can't have everything.